Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. Today is July 9th, and I, by sheer dumb luck, happen to be sitting in a Colombo hotel room. Now, for those of you who've been watching the international news, maybe you've heard that Sri Lanka is in the midst of the worst economic crisis that it's faced since its independence. For those of you who aren't familiar with the situation in Sri Lanka, what does an economic crisis look like? Well, I think one thing that clearly sticks out is that there is no fuel in the country. So a country where, people who've visited Colombo, who've seen photos of Colombo, are typically associated with probably, very, very horrible traffic. And being here for the last week, it's very eerie in that there are relatively very few cars on the road. In fact, you could almost walk on the road no matter where you are. Simply because cars, three-wheelers, vans, buses simply don't have enough fuel to run. And fuel is being rationed out generally to essential services. So the only things that are still running are buses, and they are absolutely packed because the frequencies have been cut down. So that's one of the things that, that really sums up the Sri Lankan economic crisis, is that there is a shortage of fuel, and this kind of flows on to every other aspect of the economy. It makes it very difficult for people to get to work, and it makes it very difficult to even distribute food around the country. So supply chains are crumbling. And this leads to point two. Just like Sri Lanka's struggled to import fuel, it's also struggling to import other essentials such as food and medicine. And as a result, and also due to the devaluation of the Sri Lankan rupee, which has probably, I guess, if I compare it to the currency I'm familiar with, Australian dollars, just within the last year, it's probably gone from 120 Sri Lankan rupees per Australian dollar to about, 270 rupees per Australian dollar. So it has devalued significantly, which of course means anything that's imported in Sri Lanka is going to be more expensive for locals. So locals have seen inflation in their food items, in their medicines, on a scale of 100 to 300% depending on what item they're looking at. Now, with something like fuel stocks, as somebody who's very used to being able to rather easily get around Sri Lanka, it is very difficult now to get a taxi or a three-wheeler, even to take you for short trips. And generally the prices are extremely high. So those three-wheel drivers who do manage to get fuel on the black market are typically paying 3,000 to 3,500 rupees per litre. Now in Australian dollars, this works out to be about 12 to 14 Australian dollars per litre, which is an astronomical sum, even considering that petrol prices are quite expensive globally at the moment. In Australia, we're probably paying ballpark around the 2 Australian dollar mark per litre. So fuel in Sri Lanka is costing locals, 6 times what we're paying if they're buying it on the black market. The only way not to get fuel on the black market, and this is kind of like point 3, everyone is waiting in a line in Sri Lanka. You could be waiting in a line for fuel. You might be waiting for, petrol, diesel. You might be waiting in a line for cooking gas. Many Sri Lankans, especially in capital cities, in the capital cities and large towns, rely on gas cylinders for their cooking needs. And importing gas is exactly the same as fuel. It's been very difficult. In fact, a lot of Sri Lankans have had to resort to using firewood, which is what we would have done decades ago. So we're kind of almost reverting back. So it's a very interesting situation in Sri Lanka. And this one is less significant, but it's very interesting to put out there. Public servants in Sri Lanka have been given every Friday off. And the reason they've been given every Friday off is to encourage them to grow their own vegetables, because the country expects to have significant food shortages by September. So, it's a very dire situation for locals. You can't get around. The cost of your food's gone up. Inflation is absolutely crazy, and locals are hurting hardcore. Now, for this reason, Sri Lankans have taken to the streets over the last few months, and their big ask is that the current president resign. So, again, the short answer for why is there an economic crisis in Sri Lanka, it's that there's a foreign currency crisis. Sri Lanka relies a lot on imports, and again, this explanation doesn't capture the whole picture, but Sri Lanka does not have the foreign currency reserves to pay for imports. Now, if you're a bit confused about why can't Sri Lankan rupees be used to pay for imports, that's generally not how it works. The Sri Lankan rupee isn't a particularly valuable currency when compared against the currencies in the world. Generally, things like fuel are paid for in US dollars or other currencies that can be used for trade with the world's larger economies. Now, the Sri Lankan rupee doesn't fall into that category, and as a result, countries like Sri Lanka need foreign currency reserves to pay for imports, because if you're a supplier, let's say you're a gas supplier, why on earth would you accept a currency that you can't really use for your precious fuel? And that is why Sri Lanka is currently in an economic crisis. But that's a very simplistic view, and that's kind of the immediate, this is what's happening right now, this is why it's gone bad. If we start to peel the layers back, the reason Sri Lanka is facing an economic crisis is due to multiple factors. But one of those big factors is that for many, many decades, especially in the last 20 years, corruption and mismanagement, financial mismanagement, has been absolutely rampant. So a figure that is often thrown out there is that when highways were built in Sri Lanka in the post-war period, the cost of a highway per kilometre was 3 times as much as it is in Australia. Now imagine that. A country like Sri Lanka, which is potentially closer to the imported raw materials that it needs to construct highways, or it could potentially source raw materials within Sri Lanka itself, and a country like Sri Lanka, that has significantly lower labor costs than a Western economy like Australia, the cost of building a road in Sri Lanka is 3 times that of Australia. Imagine how crazy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with corruption, the reason that it costs 3 times as much to construct a road in Sri Lanka as it does in Australia is because the excess, right? That extra 2/3 of the cost, the official cost, is actually for bribes. It often ends up in the bank accounts of politicians, offshore in the country, but it doesn't really matter. That money has essentially been stolen from the Sri Lankan taxpayer. Now, Sri Lanka it's heavily indebted, and currently it can't finance its foreign debt obligations, so it is defaulting on many, many of its loans. And the reason is it simply does not have the foreign currency to pay its debt obligations. Now, if again peeling a layer back, the people that they blame is a family known as the Rajapakshas, and they've dominated Sri Lankan politics for the last 2 decades. And these are the people that they're trying to remove from our political system, amongst other politicians who are corrupt. And currently, they've been waiting for the current president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, to resign. And today, on July 9th, 2022, people have taken to the streets to make sure to have their voices heard and to have the president resign. Because I think for a lot of Sri Lankans, again, they are having an extremely tough time. Inflation is through the roof. There's no fuel. The Sri Lankan economy is grinding to a halt. And as a result, we just need great political leadership. We need people who are empathetic, intelligent, and educated, which definitely probably aren't the 3 adjectives you'd use to describe the current batch of Sri Lankan politicians, both in government and in the opposition. So the people, again, currently have taken to the streets. The roads of Colombo are absolutely packed. The presidential palace has been stormed. That's where the president lives. And the president's office, which is the old parliament in Galle, has also been stormed. So as much as I would have liked to seen peaceful protests, tear gas has been fired into the crowds, water cannons have been used against people. But I guess for everyday Sri Lankans, they've been frustrated for months, some of them for years. I think one of the beautiful things about this current situation, as as horrible as it is, one of the silver linings is, for the last, if you look at the last 100 years of Sri Lankan politics, probably even more, 120, if you go back to the start of the 20th century, pick a decade and you can find something that went wrong in Sri Lanka. There's always been a lot of, I guess, ethnic and religious politics and violence in Sri Lanka. And one of the things that this current economic crisis has done is that it's brought a lot of communities and a lot of different people from different walks of life and different class structures in Sri Lanka. It's brought them together because the whole country is suffering, and the way it's brought people together is absolutely beautiful. I've been out on the streets, and I joined the protest this morning, as I mentioned earlier, and it's very inspiring to see people getting together and taking to the streets. And as somebody who has a Sri Lankan background, somebody who identifies as a Sri Lankan, it makes me very proud to see people cooperating like this. So that is what's currently happening in Sri Lanka. We're still yet to see whether the president will resign. We'll see what happens. But my thoughts and prayers go out to the people of Sri Lanka, and hopefully they can see a way out of this situation. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favourite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.